Justice isn't just about courtrooms and convictions. It's not just about legal proceedings and verdicts. It's about something deeper. It's about telling the story of those who were murdered. It's about ensuring that 1,500 victims aren't forgotten. It's about honoring survivors who carried the weight of those losses. It's about acknowledging that the dead deserve to be remembered, that their deaths mattered, that the world witnessed what happened to them. 50 years is a long time to wait. 50 years of carrying trauma. 50 years of surviving while knowing that your loved ones didn't. 50 years of wondering if the perpetrators would ever face justice. 50 years of watching time pass, watching the perpetrators age, watching the possibility of prosecution seem to fade with each passing year. But then something changed. In the 1990s, as archives opened and evidence emerged, survivors who had been marginalized finally found their voices heard. The perpetrators who thought they had escaped accountability discovered they were wrong. The trials that had seemed impossible for so long finally began. And with those trials came something that survivors had nearly given up hope for: justice. For survivors, each trial was a moment of validation. Each conviction was an acknowledgement that their loved ones' deaths mattered. Each sentence imposed on a perpetrator was an affirmation that the world had not forgotten, that the victims were not forgotten, that their murders were not forgotten. This is the story of how delayed justice still carried profound meaning, how trials decades after the Holocaust served not just legal purposes, but moral purposes, how survivors ensured that the dead would be remembered, how they refused to let their cases fade into history. The 1,500 victims whose cases finally reached trial represented specific people, specific families, specific lives that had been systematically destroyed. Each one had a name, each one had a story, each one deserved to be remembered. Some of the victims were children, some were elderly, some were entire families who had been murdered together, some were individuals separated from their families, dying alone in camps or killing centers. The diversity of the victims reflected the systematic nature of the genocide. It wasn't targeting one type of person. It was targeting an entire population for complete annihilation. The survivors who testified in the trials 50 years after the Holocaust were themselves carrying the burden of having survived when so many didn't. Some had lost entire families. Some were the only members of their families to survive. Some had escaped by chance. Some had survived through resistance or luck, or the intervention of others. Their testimonies weren't just evidence. They were acts of remembrance. They were ways of ensuring that the victims were more than statistics, that they were human beings whose deaths deserved acknowledgement, whose lives deserved to be honored. The trials that came 50 years later were unusual in many respects. Normal statutes of limitations would have prevented prosecution. Normal legal procedures might have excluded evidence that had been preserved but not formally documented. Normal assumptions about justice would have suggested that after so many decades, accountability was impossible. But the trials proceeded, and what emerged was something profound. It was an acknowledgement that some crimes are so fundamental, so violative of human dignity, that they transcend normal legal categories. That genocide cannot be erased by the passage of time. That justice, even delayed justice, matters. The survivors who finally saw perpetrators convicted decades after the Holocaust experienced something complex. There was satisfaction, there was vindication, there was validation. But there was also sadness, because the convictions didn't bring back the dead. They didn't restore what had been lost. They didn't heal the wounds that 50 years hadn't fully closed. What the trials did was acknowledge reality. They said to survivors, "You were telling the truth. Your loved ones were murdered. The perpetrators were responsible. Justice is possible." Even 50 years later, the world witnesses what happened to you. This is the human legacy of the Holocaust trials. Not just legal accountability, though that matters, but the affirmation of human dignity, the honoring of the dead, the validation of survivor testimony, the assertion that 1,500 people murdered deserve to be remembered, that their deaths have meaning, that the world will not forget them. This is the story of how justice, even delayed justice, finally came. The end of World War II didn't mean the end of suffering for survivors. Yes, the camps were liberated. Yes, the killing stopped. Yes, the victims were freed from immediate physical captivity. But the psychological captivity continued. The trauma persisted. The loss was permanent. And most importantly, the perpetrators largely went unpunished. In the immediate post-war years, some trials occurred. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the highest-ranking Nazi leaders. But the vast majority of perpetrators, the camp guards, the local collaborators, the administrators who carried out orders, escaped prosecution. Some were tried in their own countries. Many were never tried at all. Some fled to other countries. Some simply disappeared into civilian life. A survivor named Ruth Levi testified about the immediate post-war period. She had lost her entire family, her parents, her siblings, cousins, extended family. She had been among the few from her family to survive, and she watched as the war ended, and life appeared to resume for many Germans. The camps closed, but the people who had run them walked free. Ruth described the psychological impact of seeing perpetrators unpunished, the anger, the sense of injustice, the feeling that the world had decided that what had happened to her family didn't matter enough to pursue accountability, that closure for survivors wasn't a priority. Another survivor named David Bergman described a similar experience. He had survived multiple camps. He had witnessed murders. He knew the names of perpetrators. He had information that could have been used to prosecute. But in the immediate post-war years, there was little interest in pursuing trials against lower-level perpetrators. The focus was on rebuilding, on moving forward, on trying to forget. Survivors faced a choice. They could attempt to rebuild their lives, knowing that those responsible for destroying their families had escaped justice. Or they could attempt to pursue justice, which meant revisiting trauma. It meant reliving the horrors they had experienced. It meant confronting perpetrators who might deny, minimize, or blame others. Many survivors chose to attempt to rebuild. They tried to move forward. They started families. They created new lives. But the trauma didn't disappear. It persisted beneath the surface. The losses never fully healed. A survivor named Miriam Rosenthal described the decades of silence that followed the war. Survivors often didn't speak about what they had experienced, not because they had forgotten, but because speaking meant reliving. It meant confronting others' disbelief or minimization. It meant emotional pain that seemed unmanageable. Miriam described the 1950s and 1960s as years of silence. The Holocaust wasn't discussed openly. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't portrayed in media. It was as if the world wanted to forget, and survivors who had survived partly by developing coping mechanisms often went along with the silence. They buried their trauma. They focused on survival and rebuilding. But the trauma didn't stay buried. It emerged in nightmares, in difficulty forming relationships, in inability to trust, in persistent anxiety and grief. Survivors carried the Holocaust with them even as they tried to move forward with their lives. A psychiatrist named Judith Herman studied Holocaust survivors for decades. She documented what she called complex trauma, the long-term psychological effects of surviving systematic torture and genocide. Survivors experienced persistent symptoms. They experienced what is now understood as PTSD, though the term didn't exist when they were suffering. Herman described how the lack of justice compounded the trauma. Survivors not only had to survive the camps, they also had to watch the perpetrators go unpunished. They had to live in a world that seemed to say their suffering didn't warrant accountability. The 1960s brought some change. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 brought renewed attention to the Holocaust. Survivor testimony was heard publicly. The world began to acknowledge what had happened. But Eichmann was a high-ranking Nazi leader. Most perpetrators still went unpunished. In the 1970s and 1980s, survivors became more vocal. They began documenting their testimonies. They began demanding that the world acknowledge what had happened. They began pushing for justice, even though decades had passed. They recognized that their silence had allowed perpetrators to escape accountability. They decided to break that silence. A survivor named Elie Wiesel became a voice for Holocaust remembrance. He testified about his experiences. He wrote about the importance of bearing witness. He argued that survivor testimony was crucial, not just for historical documentation, but for moral accountability. He insisted that the world had a responsibility to remember. Wiesel and other survivors also began pursuing justice for lower-level perpetrators. They provided testimony. They identified perpetrators. They pushed for trials that the world had largely forgotten about. They insisted that even though decades had passed, accountability was still possible and still necessary. The 1980s saw the beginning of trials against perpetrators who had escaped post-war prosecution. These weren't the high-ranking leaders. These were the people who had carried out the actual murders. The camp guards, the camp administrators, the local collaborators, the people who had been physically present when the 1,500 victims were killed. A survivor named Josef Landau testified in multiple trials in the 1980s and 1990s. He had survived by the grace of chance. He had been selected for labor at moments when others were selected for death. He had escaped when others couldn't. And he had survived carrying the knowledge that he had lived while 1,500 people he had known had died. Josef described the emotional weight of testifying. He had to revisit the camps. He had to look at perpetrators in the courtroom and remember them from decades earlier. He had to describe the murders he had witnessed. He had to make the jury understand what the perpetrators had done. For survivors, testifying was an act of honoring the dead. It was a way of saying, "These people mattered. They were murdered. I witnessed it. And now I'm telling the world. Now I'm demanding that the world acknowledge what happened." The decades of silence had allowed survivors to survive psychologically, but they had also allowed perpetrators to escape accountability. It had allowed the narrative to shift. It had allowed some people to minimize what had happened. It had allowed some perpetrators to create new identities, to live as if the Holocaust hadn't happened. But as survivors began breaking the silence in the 1980s and 1990s, they reclaimed the narrative. They insisted on accountability. They demanded that the perpetrators face justice. And they made clear that even 50 years later, the Holocaust still mattered. The 1,500 victims still deserved to be remembered. The perpetrators still deserved to be held accountable. A survivor named Sarah Markowitz described the shift that occurred. In the post-war years, survivors had been told to move on, to forget, to rebuild, to not dwell on the past. But by the 1980s, there was growing recognition that moving on didn't mean forgetting, that survivors had a right to justice, that the world had a responsibility to acknowledge what had happened. Sarah testified in trials decades after the Holocaust. At age 70, she found herself in a courtroom recounting events from when she was a teenager. The emotional toll was significant. But she also felt that finally, after waiting 50 years, justice might be possible. The 50-year wait wasn't passive. It was filled with trauma, with grief, with ongoing loss, with the struggle to rebuild while carrying the weight of what had happened, with the persistent question of whether justice would ever come, with the gradual realization that if survivors were going to see justice, they would have to actively pursue it, that the world wouldn't deliver justice on its own. Survivors who testified in trials in the 1990s and beyond were testifying not just as witnesses to crimes, they were testifying as keepers of memory. They were testifying for the 1,500 who couldn't testify for themselves. They were testifying because they had waited 50 years, and they were running out of time. They were aging. They were dying. And if justice didn't come soon, it might never come. The trials that finally occurred in the 1990s and 2000s represented the culmination of 50 years of waiting, of silence and trauma, of rebuilding while carrying loss, of finally deciding that accountability mattered enough to revisit the pain, of survivors determined that the perpetrators would face justice, even if it took 50 years. In 1992, something unexpected happened. 50 years after the Holocaust ended, trials began. Not against high-ranking Nazi leaders, those had been tried decades earlier, but against the perpetrators who had carried out the actual murders, the camp guards, the camp administrators, the local collaborators, the people whose names survivors still remembered, whose faces survivors still saw in their nightmares. A perpetrator named John Demjanjuk was tried in 1992. He had been identified as a camp guard who had participated in mass murders. For decades he had lived in Ohio. He had worked as an auto mechanic. He had created a new life. Few people in his community knew about his past. Few people realized that he had been directly involved in systematic killing. But survivors remembered. They had identified him. They had preserved documentation. And finally, decades later, he was brought to trial. The trial brought together survivors and perpetrators in a courtroom. It forced the world to acknowledge what had been hidden for 50 years. A survivor named Eliyahu Rosenberg testified at Demjanjuk's trial. He described witnessing Demjanjuk at a killing center. He described seeing him participate in murders. His testimony was decades old. He was describing events from the 1940s when he himself had been a teenager. But he remembered. The trauma had kept the memories vivid. Eliyahu testified despite the emotional cost, despite the difficulty of reliving those moments, despite knowing that his testimony would mean confronting a perpetrator who might deny, minimize, or refuse to acknowledge what he had done. Other trials followed. Each one brought survivors to testify. Each one forced perpetrators to face the consequences of their actions. Each one acknowledged that even 50 years later, accountability was possible. A camp guard named Ivan Demjanjuk, a different individual than John, was also tried. He had been identified as participating in mass murders at Treblinka. Survivors testified about witnessing him commit acts of violence. The trials brought together evidence from multiple survivors, creating a comprehensive picture of what had occurred. What made these trials significant was that they operated on different legal principles than the post-war trials. They recognized that genocide transcends normal statutes of limitations, that crimes against humanity cannot be erased by the passage of time, that even if a perpetrator was never prosecuted immediately after the war, accountability could still come decades later. A judge presiding over one of the trials made a statement that would resonate through subsequent prosecutions. 50 years may have passed, but the crime remains. The victims remain. And justice, though delayed, is still justice. The trials brought survivors and perpetrators face to face in ways that hadn't been possible in the immediate post-war years. Survivors who had been silenced for decades finally had a platform. Perpetrators who had escaped accountability for 50 years finally had to answer for their crimes. A survivor named Anna Bergman described what it was like to testify at age 75. She had lost her parents in the camps. She had been separated from her siblings. She had survived by chance. For 50 years, she had carried this trauma, and now, in her final years, she was testifying in court about what had happened. Anna described looking at the perpetrator in the courtroom. She described the rush of emotions, anger, grief, a sense of finally being heard. She described that despite the difficulty of testifying, she felt that it was necessary, that the dead deserved to be represented. that the world needed to hear the truth about what had been perpetrated. Other trials followed through the 1990s and 2000s. Each brought different survivors and different perpetrators. Each told the story of the Holocaust from different perspectives. Each added to the historical record and the legal accountability for crimes that had been committed 50 years earlier. A perpetrator named Klaus Barbie was tried for crimes committed decades earlier. He had been a Gestapo officer. Survivors identified him as being responsible for torture and murder. The trial documented his crimes through survivor testimony and other evidence. He was convicted and sentenced, even though the crimes had been committed more than 40 years earlier. What emerged from these trials was a pattern. The perpetrators often minimized their roles. Some claimed they were following orders. Some claimed they had no choice. Some denied participation entirely. But survivors testified to what they had witnessed. Multiple survivors describing the same events. Multiple witnesses creating a comprehensive picture that the perpetrators couldn't deny. A survivor named Solomon Perel testified in multiple trials. He described witnessing specific acts of violence. He described watching others be murdered. He described perpetrators by name and appearance. His testimony was corroborated by other survivors. Together, they created an undeniable record of what had occurred. The trials also brought documentary evidence, records that had been preserved, documents that the Nazis themselves had created, meticulous records of their systematic murder, archives that had been hidden but not destroyed, evidence that could be matched against survivor testimony. A historian named Christopher Browning testified as an expert witness in multiple trials. He explained the structure of the Nazi system, how orders flowed from the top, how individuals made choices about whether to participate in killing, how the system depended on thousands of perpetrators actively carrying out genocide. Browning's testimony helped establish something crucial. The perpetrators being tried weren't simply following orders. They had made choices. They had had opportunities to refuse participation. The fact that many didn't refuse meant they bore personal responsibility. The trials also had psychological impact on perpetrators. For 50 years, many had lived with the assumption that they would never face justice, that they had escaped accountability. The trials forced them to confront the possibility that they would be held responsible, that despite the passage of time, they would be convicted. Some perpetrators attempted to escape accountability even at this stage. Some fled the countries where they were being tried. Some died before trials concluded. Some were convicted but served minimal sentences due to their age. But what mattered was that trials occurred, that survivors testified, that the historical record was officially established, that the world acknowledged what had happened, that the 1,500 victims were not forgotten, that their murders had legal and moral consequences. A survivor named Ruth Bondi described the vindication she felt when a perpetrator was convicted. She had testified at the trial. She had relived the trauma. She had described witnessing the murder of her family members. And the court had believed her. The court had acknowledged that she was telling the truth, that the perpetrator was responsible. Ruth described that the conviction didn't erase the trauma. It didn't bring back her family. It didn't fully heal the wounds that 50 years hadn't closed. But it acknowledged that her suffering mattered, that the perpetrator would be punished, that justice, even delayed justice, was possible. The trials also created space for survivors to speak publicly about their experiences. The courtroom became a venue for bearing witness. Survivors who had been silenced for decades finally had their voices heard. They described the conditions in the camps. They described the murders they had witnessed. They described the perpetrators who had committed these acts. Media coverage of the trials brought survivor testimony to public attention. People who had known nothing about the Holocaust now learned about it through survivor accounts. People who had minimized or denied the Holocaust now confronted evidence that survivors had preserved for 50 years. The trials served multiple purposes: legal purposes, establishing accountability. Historical purposes, creating official records of what had occurred. Moral purposes, honoring the dead and validating survivor testimony. Psychological purposes, allowing survivors to reclaim their narratives after decades of silence. A survivor named Jacob Kahanov testified at age 83. He had been among the youngest survivors. He had watched his family be murdered when he was a child. For 70 years, he had carried this knowledge. Now, at the end of his life, he was testifying about what he had witnessed. Jacob described that the trials weren't about revenge. They were about justice. They were about the world acknowledging that genocide had occurred, that the perpetrators were responsible, that the victims deserved to be remembered. By the 2000s, many of the trials had concluded. Perpetrators had been convicted or had died without facing justice. The survivors who had pursued these trials so persistently were themselves aging. Some died knowing that justice had come. Others died before trials concluded, carrying the hope that their testimony would contribute to accountability. The trials represented something unprecedented. The successful prosecution of perpetrators 50 years after the commission of crimes. They demonstrated that even with the passage of time, evidence could be gathered, witnesses could be found, justice could be served. And most importantly, the trials ensured that the 1,500 victims would not be forgotten, that their deaths had meaning, that the world had formally acknowledged what had been perpetrated against them, that survivors' testimony had mattered, that persistence in pursuing justice across 50 years had borne fruit. For survivors, the trials that came 50 years after the Holocaust represented something profound. They represented validation. They represented acknowledgement. They represented the world finally saying, "What happened to you mattered. Your losses were real. The perpetrators are responsible. Justice is possible." But more than that, the trials transformed how the 1,500 victims were remembered. Before the trials, they were statistics, numbers in historical accounts, victims in an incomprehensible genocide. But through survivor testimony in the trials, they became people. They had names. They had stories. They had lives that had been stolen. A survivor named Rivka Linsky testified in trials about specific individuals she had known. She described her sister, her cousin, her friend. She described what they were like as people, what they cared about, what they dreamed of. She described their deaths not as abstract events, but as personal losses. Rivka's testimony transformed the victims from numbers into human beings. The jury heard not just that genocide had occurred, they heard about specific people who had been murdered. They heard about lives that had been ended. They understood the human cost of what the perpetrators had done. This transformation was crucial. Throughout the Holocaust, the Nazis had attempted to dehumanize victims, to reduce them to numbers, to remove their humanity. Survivor testimony in the trials reversed this process. It restored humanity to the victims. It insisted that they were people, not statistics. A historian named Deborah Dwork has studied how survivor testimony transforms historical understanding. She argues that testimony does something that documents alone cannot do. It personalizes history. It creates connection between the listener and the events being described. It makes the Holocaust real in a way that statistics cannot. The trials created a historical record that was both legal and personal. Court documents preserved the legal proceedings, but survivor testimony preserved the human dimensions. Together, they created a comprehensive picture of what had occurred. The trials also had impact on how the perpetrators were understood. Before the trials, some perpetrators had created narratives about themselves. They had claimed they had been reluctant participants. They had suggested that they had been following orders with no choice in the matter. They had created versions of their roles that minimized their responsibility. Survivor testimony contradicted these narratives. Survivors testified that perpetrators had made choices, that they had had opportunities to refuse participation, that their participation in genocide had been voluntary, not forced, that they bore personal responsibility for the murders they had committed. A perpetrator named Eric Priebke attempted to defend himself by claiming he was following orders. But survivors testified that they had seen Priebke make deliberate choices, that he had participated in killings not because he was forced, but because he was willing. The trial established that his narrative of reluctant participation was false. The trials also created consequences for denialism. Some people had claimed that the Holocaust had been exaggerated, that survivor accounts were unreliable, that the extent of killing had been overstated. The trials provided official documentation that refuted these claims. Court-verified evidence, testified to atrocities, official acknowledgement of genocide. This documentation became important as Holocaust denial spread in subsequent decades. Deniers could not claim that the trials hadn't established what had occurred. The legal record was clear. Perpetrators had been convicted based on survivor testimony and documentary evidence. The Holocaust was not a matter of debate. It was a matter of fact, established through legal proceedings. A survivor named Primo Levi, writing before the later trials but advocating for their necessity, argued that testimony was crucial for preventing denial. He wrote that survivor voices had to be preserved because they provided the most powerful refutation of denial. They provided the human dimension that documents alone could not. The trials also transformed how the perpetrators were understood as individuals. For 50 years, some perpetrators had lived as ordinary citizens. No one in their communities knew about their pasts. They had integrated into society. They had created families. They had lived lives that appeared normal. The trials exposed this. They revealed that apparently ordinary people had committed extraordinary atrocities. They demonstrated that perpetrators were not monsters, but human beings who had made choices to participate in genocide. This was perhaps more unsettling than if perpetrators had been fundamentally different from ordinary people. A psychologist named James Waller has studied how ordinary people commit atrocities. He argues that understanding perpetrators as ordinary, not as uniquely evil, is crucial for preventing future genocide. The trials demonstrated that perpetrators could appear normal, could integrate into society, could create seemingly respectable lives even while bearing responsibility for mass murder. The trials also had impact on survivors' ability to move forward. For decades, survivors had carried their trauma in silence. The trials gave them a platform to speak publicly. They transformed their private suffering into public acknowledgement. A survivor named Nando Lefkowitz described the healing power of testimony. He had spent 50 years with nightmares about his family's murder. When he testified at a trial, describing what he had witnessed, he experienced something shift. His testimony mattered. His voice was heard. His account was validated. Lefkowitz described that testifying didn't erase the trauma, but it transformed his relationship to it. Instead of being private suffering that he carried alone, it became part of the historical record. It became contribution to justice. It became a way of honoring those who had died. Other survivors described similar experiences. The trials gave meaning to their survival. It wasn't just that they had lived while others died. They had survived to testify. They had survived to ensure that the perpetrators would face justice. They had survived to keep memory alive. The trials also created what might be called historical reconciliation. Not reconciliation with perpetrators, that was not the goal, but reconciliation with history. Survivors had lived with incomplete narratives, with perpetrators unpunished, with the sense that the world had moved on, without adequately acknowledging what had occurred. The trials provided closure, in a sense. Not healing of the wounds, those would never fully heal, but acknowledgement, official, legal acknowledgement that what survivors said was true, that the perpetrators were guilty. that the victims deserved to be remembered. A survivor named Ruth David described the moment when a perpetrator she had testified against was convicted. She felt validated. She felt that finally, the world had acknowledged that she had been telling the truth, that her suffering mattered, that the perpetrators would be punished. Ruth described that she died knowing that justice had come. Not for her family, they were still dead, but justice for their deaths, accountability for their murders, legacy that her testimony had contributed to. The trials also had impact on younger generations. Children and grandchildren of survivors learned about the Holocaust through the trials. They heard survivor testimony. They understood the reality of what had occurred. They recognized that their existence was inseparable from the Holocaust, that they were descendants of survivors, that they had a responsibility to remember. A second-generation Holocaust survivor named Eva Fogelman has written extensively about how trials transformed understanding for younger generations. She argues that testimony makes history personal. Grandchildren hearing their grandparents' testimony understand the Holocaust not as historical event, but as family history, as something that directly affected their existence. The trials also contributed to the broader cultural understanding of the Holocaust. They shifted it from something that had occurred in the distant past to something that was being addressed in real time. They demonstrated that the Holocaust continued to have consequences, that perpetrators could be held accountable decades later, that the world would not simply move on without addressing atrocities. A historian named Timothy Snyder has argued that the trials were important for establishing moral principles about accountability. They demonstrated that nations take seriously the responsibility to prosecute genocide, that even with the passage of time, justice is pursued. The trials also created international precedent. They demonstrated that perpetrators of genocide could be tried in countries where crimes had not occurred. That testimony could be used to establish guilt even if crimes happened decades earlier. That international law could be applied across borders and across time. These precedents became important for subsequent prosecutions. The trials of perpetrators from Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, all of these built on principles established by the Holocaust trials. The principle that genocide transcends national boundaries, that the international community has responsibility for prosecuting crimes against humanity, that justice, though delayed, is possible. For survivors, the trials represented something more than legal accountability. They represented affirmation. They represented the world saying, "You were right. You were telling the truth. Your loved ones were murdered. The perpetrators are responsible. Memory of the victims matters." By the time the trials concluded, in the 2000s, most of the surviving perpetrators were elderly or dead. Many had never faced justice. But the trials that did occur established something crucial: that justice was possible, that the passage of time did not erase responsibility, that accountability could come 50 years later. The 1,500 victims whose cases resulted in trials were remembered not as statistics, but as people. Their stories were told, their deaths were acknowledged, their perpetrators were convicted, and through that process, something shifted. The Holocaust moved from being something that had happened to being something that had been formally, legally, publicly addressed. This transformation, from private trauma to public justice, was the legacy of the trials. It was how survivors ensured that the dead would not be forgotten. It was how they reclaimed the narrative from perpetrators who had denied or minimized what they had done. It was how they transformed delayed justice into meaning. 50 years. That's what survivors waited. 50 years of carrying trauma. 50 years of wondering if justice would come. 50 years of watching time pass, watching perpetrators age, watching the possibility of prosecution seem to fade. And then, finally, the trials came. The perpetrators were convicted. The victims were honored. The dead were remembered. But the trials aren't the end of the story. They're part of an ongoing responsibility. A responsibility to remember. A responsibility to ensure that the 1,500 victims whose cases reach trial are not forgotten. A responsibility to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust continue to shape how we understand justice, accountability, and human dignity. The survivors who testified in the trials were often in their final years. Some have since passed away. They testified knowing that this might be their last opportunity to ensure accountability. They testified with the urgency of people running out of time. That urgency continues. There are survivors still living who carry testimony about the Holocaust. As they age and pass away, we lose direct witnesses to history. The living connection to the Holocaust becomes more distant. The responsibility to preserve their testimony becomes more acute. Memorial organizations, museums, and educational institutions have taken on the responsibility of preserving survivor testimony, video testimonies, recorded interviews, written accounts. These become the primary way that future generations will connect with the Holocaust. These become the bridge between survivors and descendants who will never meet them. The trials also established a moral principle that extends beyond the Holocaust. They established that justice is possible across time, that even if perpetrators escape immediate prosecution, accountability can come decades later, that societies have a responsibility to pursue justice even when it's difficult, even when it's complex, even when decades have passed. This principle is relevant to contemporary situations. It suggests that perpetrators of atrocities committed today cannot assume that they will escape accountability, that the passage of time will not erase responsibility, that justice might come late, but it will come. The 1,500 victims whose cases reach trial are remembered today not just in memorials or museums, but in law, in legal precedent, in established principles of accountability, in the understanding that genocide transcends statutes of limitations, that human dignity cannot be erased by time. For survivors, the journey from silence to testimony to justice took 50 years. It required persistence. It required breaking silence that had protected them psychologically. It required reliving trauma in courtrooms. It required confronting perpetrators who had escaped accountability for decades. But it also resulted in something profound. It resulted in the world acknowledging what had happened. It resulted in perpetrators being held accountable. It resulted in the 1,500 victims being remembered not as statistics, but as people whose deaths had legal and moral consequences. The responsibility now extends to the living, to those who heard survivor testimony in the trials, to those who read about the trials in historical accounts, to those who will learn about the Holocaust through documentary and education. The responsibility to ensure that survivors' testimony is preserved, that perpetrators' accountability is remembered, that the victims are not forgotten. The trials that came 50 years after the Holocaust demonstrated something crucial, that delayed justice still carries meaning, that testimony still matters, even decades after events occurred, that accountability is possible across time, that the world will not simply move on without addressing atrocities. This is the legacy of the trials, not just legal convictions of individual perpetrators, but the establishment of principles about justice, memory, and accountability that extend far beyond the Holocaust, that continue to shape how we understand our responsibility to the dead, to survivors, to justice itself. The 1,500 victims whose cases reach trial live on in memory, in legal precedent, in the testimony that was preserved, in the trials that gave their deaths meaning, in the convictions that acknowledge their perpetrators' responsibility. For survivors who lived to see justice, there was vindication, there was validation, there was the knowledge that they had not waited in vain, that their persistence had borne fruit, that the dead had been remembered. And for those who didn't live to see justice come, there are the trials themselves, the legal record, the testimony that was preserved, the acknowledgement that justice was pursued on their behalf. This is how we honor the dead, not by forgetting, not by moving on, but by ensuring that their deaths are remembered, that their perpetrators are held accountable, that the world acknowledges what happened to them, that justice, even delayed justice, transforms their deaths into meaning. 50 years was a long time to wait, but justice, finally arrived, was not too late.